The clock struck 10 p.m. as Mark Sullivan stepped into Hollow Creek Asylum for his first night shift. The old mental institution had a notorious reputation, but Mark, a seasoned nurse, wasn't easily swayed by ghost stories. The night supervisor, Mr. Harrington, a stern man with piercing blue eyes, gave him a curt nod. "Welcome, Sullivan. Your duties are straightforward. Check on patients, ensure everything's in order, and don't go wandering where you shouldn't," Harrington instructed. Mark noticed the unease in the staff's faces as they whispered among themselves. He brushed it off as nerves and started his rounds. The asylum's halls were dimly lit, the flickering lights casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, something musty, ancient. As Mark walked through the east wing, he heard a faint, rhythmic thudding. Curious, he followed the sound to room 313. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, a young woman named Emily sat on her bed, rocking back and forth. Her long, dark hair covered her face. Mark approached her cautiously. "Emily, are you all right?" he asked gently. She stopped rocking and slowly lifted her head, revealing wide, terrified eyes. "They come at night," she whispered. "The shadow. They whisper my name." Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. "Who comes at night?" Emily pointed to the corner of the room. "They watch from the darkness." Mark glanced at the corner but saw nothing. He reassured Emily and left the room, but the sense of unease lingered. At midnight, Mark decided to take a break in the staff lounge. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, the lights flickered and he heard soft whispers. He turned, but the lounge was empty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Mark, come to us." He shook his head, trying to dismiss the voices as fatigued. He returned to his rounds, but the whispers followed him, growing louder with each step. In the west wing, he heard a soft sobbing. He followed the sound to room 217, a room that was supposed to be unoccupied. The door creaked open, revealing a young boy sitting on the floor, hugging his knee. "Hey, buddy," Mark said softly, kneeling beside the boy. "What's your name?" The boy looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Tommy. They won't leave me alone." Mark's heart ached for the boy. "Who won't leave you alone?" Tommy pointed to the shadow. "The people who died here. They want to play." Mark felt a cold chill. "It's okay, Tommy. I'll protect you." He took Tommy's hand and led him to the nurse's station. Mr. Harrington was there, his face pale. "Where did you find him?" Harrington demanded. "In room 217. He says the spirits are bothering him." Harrington's expression darkened. "Room 217 has been closed for years. That boy died here decades ago." Mark's blood ran cold, but he was just. The lights flickered again, and the whispers grew louder, more menacing. "Join us, Mark." Desperate to understand what was happening, Mark turned to Harrington. "What's going on here?" Harrington sighed heavily. "This asylum was built on cursed land. The spirits of those who died here are trapped, unable to move on. They prey on the living, seeking to draw them into their eternal torment." Mark's mind raced. "How do we stop them?" "We can't," Harrington replied grimly. "All we can do is survive the night." Determined not to let the spirits win, Mark decided to confront them. He returned to room 217, armed with a flashlight and a newfound resolve. The room was colder than before, the air thick with an oppressive presence. "Show yourselves," Mark demanded. The shadows shifted, forming into the faint outlines of people, patients who had suffered and died within these walls. They reached out to him, their whispers filling the room. "Join us, Mark." "No," he shouted. "You're not taking me." The spirits recoiled, their forms wavering. Mark felt a surge of hope. "You don't belong here. You need to move on." The spirits' whispers turned to wails of anguish. The room shook, and Mark felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. He turned to see Emily standing behind him, her eyes wide with fear. "They're angry," she whispered. "They don't want to leave." Mark's mind raced. He remembered reading about how unfinished business could trap spirits. "What do you want?" he asked the shadows. A ghostly figure stepped forward, its face twisted in pain. "Justice for the experiments." Mark's heart sank. The asylum's dark history of cruel experiments on patients was well documented. "I'll make sure your story is told," he promised. "But you have to let us go." The spirits paused, their forms flickering. Slowly, they began to retreat into the shadows. The oppressive air lifted, and the room grew warmer. Emily's face softened with relief. "Thank you," she whispered before fading away. Mark stumbled out of the room, exhausted but triumphant. He returned to the nurse's station, where Harrington and the other staff awaited him. "It's over," Mark said. "For now." Harrington nodded. "You've done more than anyone else. You've given them a chance at peace." As the first light of dawn broke through the window, Mark knew he had survived the night, but he also knew that Hollow Creek Asylum would always be haunted by its dark past. He vowed to bring the asylum history to light, to ensure that the spirits found the justice they deserved. And as he left the asylum that morning, Mark felt a sense of closure. He had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, determined to help others find their way out of the shadows. It was nearing midnight when Sarah stepped into the Hollowbrook Asylum for her first night shift. The asylum had a notorious history, its halls haunted by rumors of unspeakable horrors. Sarah, a recent nursing graduate, had heard the stories but dismissed them as superstitions. She was determined to prove herself, even in a place as eerie as this. The head nurse, Mrs. Dawson, a stern woman with graying hair, met her at the entrance. "Welcome, Sarah. Your duties are to check on patients every hour and ensure nothing is out of the ordinary. And remember, don't venture into the East Wing. It's been closed for years." Sarah nodded, her curiosity piqued but her resolve firm. "I understand, Mrs. Dawson." The shift started quietly. Sarah made her rounds, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the dimly lit corridors. The patients were mostly asleep, their troubled dreams evident in their restless movements and occasional murmurs. At 1 a.m., Sarah heard a faint humming sound. It was coming from room 307, where an elderly patient named Mr. Whitaker was kept. She found him sitting up in bed, his eyes glazed and distant. "Mr. Whitaker, are you all right?" she asked softly. He turned to her, his face gaunt and shadowed in the dim light. "The children, they're calling. Can't you hear them?" A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Children? There are no children here, Mr. Whitaker." He pointed a trembling finger towards the door. "In the East Wing. They play and sing, but they're not alive. Not anymore." Sarah tried to reassure him, but her own nerves were frayed. She returned to the nurse's station where Mrs. Dawson was reviewing patient charts. "Mrs. Dawson, Mr. Whitaker mentioned hearing children in the East Wing. Do you know anything about that?" Mrs. Dawson's expression darkened. "That wing was closed after a fire 20 years ago. Several patients and staff died, including some children. We don't talk about it." Sarah's curiosity grew. "But what if the patients and still hear them?" Mrs. Dawson shook her head. "It's just their minds playing tricks. Focus on your duties, Sarah." As the night wore on, the asylum grew colder. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At 3 a.m., she heard the humming again, clearer this time. It was a nursery rhyme, hauntingly beautiful and sorrowful. Against her better judgment, she followed the sound, her footsteps taking her towards the forbidden East Wing. The door to the East Wing was locked, but Sarah found an old set of keys hanging in the nurse's station. She hesitated for a moment before taking them. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, decrepit hallway. The air was colder here, and the smell of smoke and decay lingered. She walked cautiously, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The humming grew louder, echoing off the crumbling walls. Sarah's heart pounded as she reached what had once been the children's ward. Inside, she saw faint, ghostly figures of children playing. Their laughter and singing filled the air, a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless surroundings. Among them was a little girl with long, dark hair, her eyes sad and hollow. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her breath visible in the frigid air. The girl looked up, her expression sorrowful. "We're the lost one, trapped here because of the fire. Can you help us?" Sarah felt a surge of compassion. "How can I help you?" "Remember us," the girl said softly. "Tell our story." The figures began to fade, their voices blending into the wall. The coldness lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Sarah stood there for a moment, absorbing what she had witnessed. She made her way back to the main hall, her mind racing. Mrs. Dawson was waiting for her, a look of concern on her face. "Sarah, where have you been?" Sarah took a deep breath. "I went to the East Wing. I saw them." "Mrs. Dawson, the children, they want us to remember them." Mrs. Dawson's stern demeanor softened, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I tried to forget, to keep the past buried, but maybe it's time we faced it." The next day, Sarah and Mrs. Dawson organized a memorial service for the victims of the fire. Staff and patients gathered in the courtyard, holding candles and sharing stories. The atmosphere was solemn but healing. As they stood together, a warm breeze swept through the courtyard, and for a moment, Sarah could hear the faint sound of children's laughter carried on the wind. From that night on, the haunting whispers and eerie occurrences in Hollowbrook Asylum ceased. The spirits of the past had found peace, their stories finally told. Sarah continued her work, knowing she had made a difference, and the asylum became a place of healing, not just for the living but for the souls who had been trapped in its dark history.